This is a continuation of the formulas lesson talking about midpoint. Before, when we talked about midpoint, you were given the endpoints and you used the midpoint formula to find the midpoint. But what if you're given, instead of both endpoints, what if you're given one endpoint and the midpoint? How do you find the other endpoint? Now it looks tricky, but it's actually very easy. Just make sure that you don't accidentally just use the midpoint formula with these 2 points, because it'll give you the wrong answer. If you will, just draw a segment with a midpoint in the middle. We'll label the midpoint coordinates. Don't worry about where they might appear on the coordinate plane. Let's just label them here. -2, -7, and the endpoint for -6. Now we're looking for this point over on the right. If you accidentally use the midpoint formula here, that would give you the midpoint of this section, which would give you an answer that fits right there. You don't want that. You want the other side. So the way to do this is to look at your x coordinates by themselves, find out how far apart they are, and then since the midpoint is in the middle, you would go that same distance on the other side to get the new x value. And then for the y's, go from the first y to the second one, how far did you go, and go that same distance again to the other side. So here's what I mean. From 4 to -2. From 4 to -2, we are subtracting 6. So let's subtract 6 more. And to subtract 6 more, -2 minus 6 is -8. Do the same for y. From -6 to -7, we're subtracting 1. Let's subtract 1 more to get to the other side. -7 minus 1 is -8. It was just by chance that they ended up being the same number. But that's what you do. How far apart are the x's? Go the same distance on the other side. How far apart are the y's? Go the same distance on the other side. So our answer is -8, -8. And we're not going to do this for each one, but if you wanted to check, you can do the midpoint formula with the endpoint and this endpoint that you just found, and you'll get the midpoint. So let's see. Midpoint says x plus x and divide by 2, and y plus y, that's a -6 plus -8, and divide by 2. 4 plus -8 is -4. -6 plus -8 is -14. -4 halves is -2. And -14 halves is -7. And guess what? That is the same as our midpoint. So it checks out just fine. You don't have to check it. Maybe you want to check it mentally. Maybe you want to write it down. But it does work. If you check the answer endpoint with the given endpoint, you will get the midpoint. Next question. The job is exactly the same. So let's see here. Let's draw our segment. The midpoint is at -3, 5. One endpoint is 0, 0. What's the other endpoint? So let's travel. Where do the x's go? From 0 to -3, we are subtracting 3. So we will subtract 3 more. We go the same distance because the midpoint's in the middle. Each section on each side of the midpoint is the same, so that distance traveled is the same. -3 minus 3 is -6. Do the same for y. From 0 to 5, we are adding 5. Add 5 more, and you get 10. And that's your answer. -6, 10. And if you want to check that, check this endpoint, -6, 10, with the given endpoint, 0, 0. Do the midpoint formula there, and you will get negative 3 comma 5. Question 3. Same exact job. Midpoint is negative 2, negative 2. Endpoint is 8, 6. What's the other endpoint? So travel along the x's. From 8 to negative 2, you're subtracting 10. And again, if you can't tell what that distance is, do the end minus the beginning. Negative 2 minus 8 is negative 10. Go 10 more. Negative 2 minus 10 is negative 12. Sometimes it's easy to see what the distance traveled is, but sometimes it might be too far to be able to figure it out easily. From 6 to negative 2, we are subtracting 8. If you're having trouble there, do the end of the line, which is negative 2, or do where you're traveling to. We're traveling to the midpoint here. So from negative 2 minus 6. Negative 2 minus 6 is negative 8. We're subtracting 8. Subtract 8 more. Negative 2 minus 8 is negative 10. So negative 12, negative 10 is our other endpoint. And if you do the midpoint formula with that answer and that endpoint, you'll get this midpoint. A couple more here. Same exact job. Practice makes perfect here. Midpoint at negative 14 comma 11. Endpoint at negative 6 comma 5. What is the other endpoint? Travel along the x route from 6 to negative 14. Negative 14 minus negative 6 is negative 8. We are subtracting 8. Subtract 8 more. Negative 14 minus 8 is negative 22. Travel along the y's. From 5 to 11, that one's pretty easy. From 5 to 11, I'm just adding 6. But again, if you want to do 11 minus 5, that's a 6. Adding 6 there. Well, let's add 6 more. Add 6 more. 11 plus 6 is 17. So negative 22 comma 17 is the other endpoint. And the last one. Now once again, remember, you do this method when you're given the midpoint and one endpoint. If you're given both endpoints and you're looking for the midpoint, just do the midpoint formula. But since we know the midpoint, we have to do it a different way. So midpoint here is 7, negative 7. One endpoint is negative 3, negative 5. What is the other endpoint? Travel with the x's from negative 3 to 7. I'm adding 10. That's a 7 minus negative 3, which is positive 10. Adding 10, let's add 10 more. 7 plus 10 is 17. Now look at the y values. From negative 5 to negative 7. Negative 7 minus negative 5 is negative 2. We're subtracting 2. And let's subtract 2 more. Negative 7 minus 2 is negative 9. So 17 comma negative 9 is the answer there. So when you're given the midpoint and one endpoint, to get the other endpoint, travel from the end to the middle. How far did you go? And go that same distance on the other side. Do that with x and do that with y, and it will give you the other endpoint. If you're not sure if you did it right, check both endpoints. Take the endpoint that was your answer and the endpoint that you were given. Use the midpoint formula and you will get the midpoint that you were given, provided that you worked it out correctly.